Jim left off. And I should also note that Jim is a Bass fellow as well. And, one can't do wrong just trying to, keep up with Jim and watching him go further away. But you aim for the stars. It's kind of our tradition in this workshop to just, hit you with tons and tons of material, all right? It's like the spaghetti model. Some things are going to stick, most things aren't. I'm going to try to point to a few pieces of spaghetti that I hope will stick, and they're not like equation-based, but they're thought-based. And the first one is where Jim left off, which is most of our methods problems are really theory problems in disguise, which is kind of great and kind of like, oh, right? You're never going to find a model that solves your problems when you're trying to answer complex questions. So in many ways, people spin their wheels a long time trying to find the right model, the right estimator, and really you should pursue relentlessly the question. What am I trying to learn about the world? And you may have to run lots and lots and lots of different models and then, sort through to help us learn what you've learned. All right. So network analysis really has these two research goals. And the first part of part one, and I hope you'll all come back for part two next year. The first part of part one has been a lot more about descriptive kinds of techniques, trying to accurately describe a social structure. Just description is hugely important in lots of contexts. But we're moving more into a context in which we're really trying to understand networks as being things that are the causes of certain things. Today, I'll be talking about flows, like things that spread through networks. And then later on today, we'll be talking more about the consequent, the sort of more the networks as outcomes when you're trying to predict ties. And that's when you're going to get into ergum, sturgum. And then tomorrow, I'm going to try to tee up a little bit for David Schaefer and thinking about the stochastic actor-oriented model or Siena model, which kind of does both of these things in a kind of dynamic coevolution sort of sense. So, stop me anytime. Raise your hands. I'm just, in the tradition. I'm going to be covering a lot of things. The first thing is trying to think more about diffusion and then social influence. So the main way of thinking about why networks matter for how things flow through networks is if we look at a kind of view of the world that's very atomistic. Let's say that we did a survey and we asked people how many sexual partners they'd had in the last year, and then we just looked at the people who had had 2 sexual partners in the last year, we would get a view of the world like this. And we might be thinking about some important outcome, something that might diffuse through this, the probability that this person is going to be infected with some STI or not. And in this case, we would have a very rough model. 2 is definitely more likely than 1, is definitely more likely than 0. But if we interject a network in it, and maybe how many of you have seen this network? Few of you. This is a very famous network and something that Jim and others worked on. This is a single high school romantic sexual relation network over the course of a year. This wasn't a weekend. Wasn't the 70s. It's like so this was in the 90s, right, Jim? So definitely in the wake of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And one of the cool parts of this paper is that Jim and others show that this network, this sort of what predicts the ties in this network are very interesting combination of things. But one of them seems to be a kind of prohibition on dating your ex's ex. That people, they call it the kind of romantic leftovers rule. And the people in the network don't even quite articulate that, but they kind of follow this rule, it seems. But what are the consequences? Clearly, this and this give us very different views of the world with very different possibilities. So the whole point of network analysis is structure matters. It matters if you are a person here or you're a person here, you still have had two partners, but if you're in this main component and the structure of the main component itself, all of those things matter for flows. They matter for flows of things that are good, that you want, and they matter for things that are bad, that you don't want. So the main model here is that you are in many ways the company that you keep, that over time we tend to become more similar to those who we have ties with. And that may be something that happens gradually, or it may be something that, what's the old saying, it happened gradually and then all at once, right? So there may be sort of tipping points, there may be ways that after you spend a certain amount of time, then it kind of clicks over. So I've been studying a lot of these processes, not necessarily in the realm of health. You've looked at all kinds of descriptive measures at this point, how dense the network is, how much connectivity and cohesion there is, the centrality and centralization that is. Our networks really held together by a few stars. It's like the collaboration network at Duke, if Jim were to leave, we'd just fall apart. What would we do? So that's very different than some other networks that are held together by a bunch of, pretty good people that are active. You've learned about small worlds, yes, a little bit. So the small world connectivity is this observation that goes back to a lot of social psychology, that people's networks tend to be very clustered locally. We tend to have strong local clustering, but we also have acquaintances that bridge distances of the social structure. So those bridges tend to be weak ties of acquaintanceship, not my best friend, but those weak ties tend to be incredibly important in flows of things, like, things that you want and things that you don't want. So, what is peer influence then? It just seems that so many of us in social sciences are trying to understand something about the effects that relations have on people's attitudes and behaviors. And I think in the study of health, maybe the emphasis has been a little more on behaviors, but obviously there's a huge segment of trying to think about people's attitudes and the link between attitudes and behaviors. Peer influence is a type of diffusion model. It is really concerned with the flow of something through people's ties. So it gauges these effects, but it focuses on, as the name would indicate, peers. It tends to focus on people who are friends, who are collaborators, people who are colleagues, people who tend to be in the same. Now there can be status or prestige differences and things like that. I would say Jim is my peer, but clearly much more, in the realm of informal and formal hierarchies, there are differences. So we focus it on friends and colleagues because we think that that's a particularly important place to think about these processes. Now, yesterday, Ashton talked a lot about how this has overlooked the importance of kinship, and I agree. Family is very important too. The emphasis tends to be on a small to medium-sized scale rather than on huge diffusion processes, rather than trying to understand the spread in very large networks. Although, again, there's a kind of, slippage there. And the things that spread, not always, but oftentimes, they can change as they move through the network. That if I tell you a really good joke, you might, just slightly change it or something like that, right? That we can think about, and this is why one of the reasons why cultural sociologists are so interested in peer influence is because it seems that the origin of so many of our important beliefs and attitudes are developed through this ongoing evolutionary process, like a huge telephone game, where people are constantly influencing each other, but slightly maybe adjusting things. So the origins of religion in the world, like why are there so many similar kinds of religions in the world? It's like, and being a scientist, I don't think it's because the people from the Pleiades came here and seeded us. It's not the ancient civilization, aliens, Ancient Aliens, History Channel. It's on the History Channel. What's going on? It's not Ancient Aliens, okay? But there's something about the commonality of our brains and how we remember things and how we tell things, how we influence each other, that tends to converge. Kind of like how crab-like creatures have evolved at least 3 or 4 different times and places. It's just the environment selects for these things. All right, I can go off. So the outline here then is I realized kind of in a little bit of a panic last night around 11:30, I don't know if we've really covered diffusion straight up, and that's kind of important for thinking about networks and health. Kind of, there's something kind of happened recently, and a lot to do with diffusion of things. So I'm going to cover this very quickly, but Jim Moody is absolutely the star in this, and I maybe, we'll do a little, if we need to, a little back and forth over there. Having Jim in one's personal network during COVID was just amazing. I remember very early on we had a conversation because right away when it was spreading here, it happened in RTP. It happened it was Amgen people, right? They'd gotten it at a conference in Boston, and it started to come into the network here through a very sort of more, elite sort of group of people. And Jim just said, that's not gonna last. So once it gets into people in these other areas, it's gonna be a totally different story, right? So being able to bounce ideas off of Jim over the course of COVID is like, it was like having my own, like authority on MSNBC or something. And now we're going to go to Jim Moody. What's going to happen, So again, this is going to tee us up for more hardcore statistical models to follow. Okay, and I have until 11:30, right? 12:30? No, I'm just kidding. Seriously, how long do I have? I have an hour. No, 11:15. Okay. We'll see. So you may have heard of this thing called R naught, yes, or not. You've heard of R naught is the reproductive rate of. Well, maybe we just do this together, like a little stand-up act. Okay. So the R naught is what we all were paying attention to a lot. If it's over 1, that's bad. The thing is spreading. It's going into the higher above 1, the more it's taking off, right? Remember, we were trying to bend the curve. We're trying to get that R naught down in some ways. And we had social distancing, which was just like, for a sociologist, was just the worst kind of term. It's like, we're not socially distancing. That's awful. We don't want that. We're physically distancing. So the point here is that R naught depends on the probability that a contact will be infected over the duration of the contact, beta, the likelihood of the contact, C, and the duration of infectiousness, D. And this is where things get networky, because the probability of contact, the likelihood of contact, is a network effect. And it depends entirely on the underlying topology of the network. So most diffusion models have this kind of S-shaped curve, right? That there's a slower period that, bless you, that reaches some kind of period of critical mass, takeoff, density dependence, and that then it shoots through a very rapid period, and then once everybody's gotten it, and boy, it was fun the first time and the second time, it levels off. Nobody knows a priori these things, right? It's very difficult to predict, but many of the simulations that Jim engages in gives us a good sense of what we might expect under certain conditions. Most models of this assume a heterogeneous mixing. That is a kind of a random network where we're just all kind of just randomly, interacting with each other. And that's why this is a smooth curve. It's a smooth curve because if it's a random mixing, it's going to be basically a kind of slow, blah, blah. It's going to spread over here, and then it's going to take off, and then it's going to level off. But that's not the social world. So most processes are not this kind of smooth S-shaped diffusion. They go through periods of local maxima where they kind of, and then they stall out. And just as Jim pointed out with the Amgen crew, it's like, okay, but once it jumps into a new part of the network, it takes off again. So one of the ways that people think about this stuff is just about individual characteristics, that there are some people that are maybe more susceptible for whatever reason to the spread of a contagion. And maybe that's a good contagion or a bad contagion. Right? Maybe your immune system is different, but maybe also if it's something that's good, maybe you're a cutting edge person who's just like, I'm always looking for the new thing. I'm a leading person, right? I'm an innovator, right? And then there are others who are laggards, who are just like, I don't know. It's like, I like Taylor Swift when she's classic rock, just like, just so it takes time for some people. Those are just kind of individual models. So if that's the case, the spread, again, has much more to do with individual variation. Now, we're sociologists, we're social network scholars. Structure matters. Structure matters. Structure matters. Structure matters. Structure. I want you to. The structure matters. So one of the early studies of this, which has already been touched upon a little bit, is about the diffusion of this new drug. I'm not sure I can pronounce it. Gamma-nim. It's like a tetracycline. It was like a, Coleman, Katz, and Menzel kind of show that there were some doctors who were more central in the network, seemed to adopt this more rapidly and spread it through social contagion. Later on, Ron Burt and others have kind of reappraised this, and maybe this had a little bit more to do with what they call structural equivalence and monitoring of your competitors. But the general idea is that there's a direct path of influence, but there can also be indirect paths of influence as well. Those most diffusion studies focus more on the direct paths, the friends in this, or colleagues. So there are various tipping points, and then Jim touched on this briefly yesterday about threshold models, that there may be some kinds of contagions that are more complex, that spread, it doesn't spread quickly. Like a simple contagion, like COVID, right, is I was in the elevator, it was pretty simple. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was on a plane, not with my 235 best friends, but just, there. So it's a simple contagion, but there are social contagions that are also pretty simple too, about, like I said, like good jokes or gossip, something you want to tell. It can just kind of flows really easily and moves through the network really quickly. There are other kinds of contagions, probably a lot of the sort of behavioral things that many of you are interested in that have to do are more complicated. Is it the first time that you meet somebody in high school who's like smoking a cigarette that you're like, that's bitchin', give me those, lighten it up. Yeah, I love that, I'm addicted, let's go. It's like, it doesn't happen that way, right? It happens slowly, and it's a more complex, there's a threshold. So I grew up in the 80s when everybody still smoked, right? My brother smoked, my dad smoked. I went to school, seemed like all the cool kids smoked. I ran into an attractive person. I said, you're smoking. That looks good. And then, off we were to the races. And then I ended up hanging out with this whole group of people behind the Circle K where it was at this little dead end. And we started calling ourselves they were the dead end kids. Where are you going? The dead end. There's a little cigarette machine, like pull the handle, get your Pall Malls, like, 5 quarters. That's all it was. Ding, ding, ding. There are people in that place. They're like, I know they're 15, but I'm making so much money here at this coffee shop. So there's just like this whole ecology that built up around it. Got into theater that way, of course, right? And then, bam, I'm at NYU, Tisch School of the Arts. There you go. And I blame it all on cigarettes, which I quit very quickly after that, after I dropped out of theater school, actually. All right. So complex contagions are more like that. They also may be upheld more by beliefs and things that I obsess on. What I want you to take away from part 1 is the topology matters. The timing also really matters. And I'm sure Jim, and I'm sure we'll get to this stuff. It's in the book too. If this is your jam, then there's a lot more to go into it with. You all got links to the tutorials for the book, yes? So chapters 14 and 15, you might want to walk through some of those tutorials to get a little deeper dive into this. So I never do R in public, you know. John Morgan, I mean, that's masterful. I'm sitting in the back, I'm like, how's he doing this? It's like, it's not blowing up. Okay. And then culture and meanings and attitudes. So this is where most of my work has been done, and I do think it has a lot to do with health as well. This network, the topology, is particular. This is one high school, right? The spread in this network, obviously, again, the timing matters. This didn't all happen in one weekend. This isn't like, so some people were early adopters, I guess, if you will, in the year, and others kind of came in later. But the overall structure of this has implications for the flows of many things. It's actually kind of, I guess, kind of a hopeful structure in some ways, because there are all of these choke points around the main component, where if you think about the probability of something flowing through here, it has to go through a very narrow path. And the probability being a stochastic process, it's not guaranteed. And if that doesn't happen, then the spread is kind of stymied. That's very different than other kinds of networks. There's always, if what you want is a network that is conducive to the spread, this is a bad network, and you want to try to get a different network. So in my postdoc at Stanford, we were very interested in trying to what facilitates collaboration and knowledge flows among faculty. Those are good things. It's really good to talk with your colleagues across disciplinary boundaries, right? Stanford spent over $1 billion, and this was a long time ago when $1 billion meant something, and tried to create different interdisciplinary research institutes to try to thicken up the networks. And so this is BioX, which focuses on bioengineering, and you can see that there are faculty in the natural sciences and medicine, and you can then see engineering is kind of where these different disciplines fit in this overall structure is very interesting. So there might be some dense pockets that you're thinking, if I'm trying to facilitate the spread of knowledge and influence and creative thought, innovation, you could, if you have this understanding of the structure, then you have a lot of understanding of where interventions could be made. And you also maybe know where, if this is a structure that you want to disrupt, where you're trying to disrupt the flow, you might target certain areas like here, between engineering and the natural sciences in particular, seems to be one of those kind of, it's not just that one tie in the sexual network, but it's a kind of narrow, it's a little narrow tunnel, so you might want to disrupt that somehow. And so if you were somehow able to give early retirements or something, get these faculty out, you would thin this a lot in terms of the BioX faculty being removed from the network. So the topology matters. And there's always kind of a trade-off, because as networks become more dense and more modular, they become more of that kind of small world structure of kind of dense pockets that are kind of more loosely tied to each other. There's kind of two things that happen. The density makes it so there are lots of non-redundant paths between everybody, right? There's not just one path. So I might not need to directly infect you. I could do it indirectly. And if there's multiple indirect paths, then that's an issue. But also, as networks become more dense, they also tend to have a local clustering, and they tend to have sort of more holes, structural holes, as we call them, tend to have structural holes to other parts of the network. So this, Jim, am I saying that right? So there's a trade-off in thinking about these things. So the first point, right, the first spaghetti that I want to really stick was methods problems are usually theory problems in disguise. Second is network form matters. So one can't pass on information or something else unless they're directly or indirectly tied. The connectivity refers to how actors in one part of the network are connected to actors in another part of the network. If you're not reachable, then no problem. That's not going to spread. Or maybe it's a big problem if you want it to spread. The distance, given that actors can be reached, how many steps are they from one another? So if you are tied, but it's a long journey to get tied to someone, they're reachable, but the path is, distance is long. So if something has a probability of flowing through the ties, like a wire, if it's like at each little juncture, there's a probability that it might fail. The longer that path, the more likely the failure. But then the more paths, it kind of pulls it in the other direction. So the number of paths really matter in this case. So multiple routes. That's probably the key here is to think about some of Jim's work again with Doug White on structural cohesion, that some networks are more connected, that they have multiple non-redundant paths that connect the actors in them. And that would be particularly important for the ways that simple contagions will flow through those ties. But also, I guess, when you have multiple direct ties, then that might trigger your threshold. So it's hard to think of a network that has multiple non-redundant ties but not thick interfaces. Yes, question.
I'm curious about your thoughts on how this, if you look at could you visualize hybrid networks where you have people that have physical relationships but also have relationships online, and some of those are repeated connections, but they're not the same. So diffusion of ideas, maybe, and how that, I don't know.
Yeah, no, so multiplex ties is have we covered that a bit? Yeah, so certainly I think we all understand that social life is often layered, that there are, it's like Jim's my colleague, but he's my friend, right? And that there are ways that, people, have formal, informal, that they have different kinds of relations to each other. And that really has served as a function of, in particular, thinking about role analysis. So you stack matrices of multiple different types of relationships to try to figure out what are the kinds of people that exist in this social structure, right? Does that make sense? So you could do the same, you certainly could do the same thing with diffusion to try to think about what kind of connectivity it matters more than others. You could do a little horse race, it's I think that many of us, for example, who've studied political polarization have thought in the past that direct friendship ties matter more than online kinds of ties. Well, guess what? I think we're wrong. It turns out that the psychologists have been kind of right all along, that our relationships are kind of in our head. And if, people, think about all the people who are just my daughter, my best friend, all these people think I'm crazy, but GK76 says they're drinking children's blood. I'm all in on it, right? So is that answering your question in some way?
I guess I'm curious about what happens when they're not inherently separate networks, but thinking about my own social media use patterns of what happens when you have these connections that are physically formed relationships, but also have these connections, and as you move through distance, those networks aren't breaking off in organic patterns in the way that you normally would, where you're removing geographic settings.
Yeah.
You're now connected through these people, and you still those online networks might be a space for continued strengthening of those those bond relationships, or maybe because you see these people, you see them, but you don't actually know what's going on in their life, you're actually having, there are weak ties that never end up being cut.
I do think that's like a really interesting area for development, and it reminds me of when we were presenting to some folks, and that they were saying that in the military they seem to be having a harder time with sort of some of the commitment generating mechanisms that they've had in the past, because generally to get people to commit, you separate them from their past, right? And then you generate all the kinds of strong ties within the network. But if they're like, going into the bathroom and they're like on their phone and they're interacting with their friends and their family, there's this other tie that's kind of competing with the earlier model of socialization that's going on. So it's like, in that case, it becomes an impediment to the social influence processes that seem to be vital for generating the kind of group commitment that enables people to basically kill and die for each other, right? That if they're like not separated and really generating those strong ties, because they're also kind of have this online and social media life. So that's more what you're saying, right? I don't have an answer for that except to say that go out and do that. And I think, do you know other research that's been, because I think that that's a cutting edge kind of set of thoughts. Yeah.
My guess is that there's some well of social attention in critters, humans have as critters. And the extent to which we have these kind of distraction features are going to, on the one hand, if you're multiply connected, you essentially have made each path a little bit wider. You have two new channels. But I think most online relations aren't, a lot of online relations, the reason they're kept online is because they're taking you to parts of the world. And so they're distracting, they're drawing down that well of human attention you have to invest. And so I suspect it is a trade-off. I think all of these principles apply. And this is, a network is a pipe in this case. And so the fact that you have a 6-inch pipe versus a 12-inch pipe doesn't really matter, they're both pipes. And so the fact that they are working in different, or the question of whether or not they're connecting to the same sink or not. And, I think if they're not, the water gets spread over a much thinner surface.
That's a great way of thinking about it. And also I think to connect with to draw out the analogy a little bit more, I think the answer to the earlier question in some ways was, we used to assume that interpersonal ties were wider pipes. And that assumption has been called deeply into question, right? That what the width of the pipe may be a thing that is not necessarily dependent on co-presence and things like that. So just a quick view of this. You can see in this case, we live in a world of disconnected, node connectivity. In this world, we have a kind of one node that is sort of the cut point here, that between the two. Here there are two, and here there are multiple paths connecting. There are 3 paths connecting, each independent paths connecting the actors. So you basically end up in a situation where the diffusion, of course, is never certain. So the probability is always depends on the distance of the pipe in this case, right? With how many junctures does it have to go through? So it has to go through here and it has to go through there, and at each time it may not necessarily spread. So diffusion increases with each alternative path connecting pairs of people in the network. And the probability that actor I infects actor J, Pij, is a constant over all relations. In this case, if it's 0.06 is the assumption, then in this case, S and T are connected through the following structure like this. At each stage, it has to go through, but there are two. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paths here, 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But there are 2 independent paths in that case. So in this case, it is 0.09 is the probability of the infection transferring. So the probability that so basically, there are lots of ways of calculating this. I don't want to put us back to sleep with math too much, but I'll put that out there. The illustration of it is easier to sort of get your head around, which is if we think of a constant probability of infection of 0.6, and we think of 10 non-redundant paths, then if there are 2, right, and then if there are 2 of 10, sorry, if there are 10 paths, it's almost certain. If there are 10 independent paths, it's almost certain to have a diffusion, right? And that goes down with the path distance. So as the paths, there's the number of paths, and then there's the distance of the paths, and those things are kind of toggling different parts of the probabilities. So as well as the constant probability of an infection. So if that is 1, then everybody just gets it when they're in contact, right? But there's some kind of stochastic process there that could go down in this case, right? That if it's 0.3 instead of 0.6, then we see very, very steep drop-offs in terms of path distance. The path distance matters. I know, Jim, you have a lot to add. So what are a couple other things that they might think of before we move straight forward to peer influence?
As far as basic sort of biological diffusion or these other types of diffusions goes, is that all of these simulations that we've done in this case are one path at a time and independent paths. But I think it's also this notion that we're holding constant. There's great biology, and I think perhaps great sociology to be done on whether or not people's sort of susceptibility or continuous sort of essentially what affects PIJ. Because you can see the probability of transfer has a huge effect, a direct effect. And if it's the case that the fact that I work 6 jobs and I'm exhausted, it probably means that I'm more susceptible to getting the disease, in addition to all the rest of this. So there's, as I think Craig's going to point out here in a minute, in social diffusion, we're used to thinking about the feedback processes of what's going on with the person, if you will, and the person. But it's just as true in everything else we do. So I think that there's a very good reason to think about that some of these simplifying assumptions should be problematized both on the medical side and the consumer side.
So stay tuned. Lots of great work, building on different kinds of simulations, trying to predict outbreaks. Jim's, done some very interesting work looking at kind of different ways that networks can, different kinds of networks are involved in how diseases kind of emerge and spread. So you've got like an animal-to-animal network that's layered onto like a person-to-animal network that's layered onto a person-to-person network. So you've kind of got ways of trying to build in a kind of multiplexity to this, and in fact, with different kinds of nodes. And so there's a lot of great work, I think, and now computational power and tools that are being developed here to try to do this sort of work. Now, I don't do this sort of work. I think about it, and I read it, and I think it's fascinating. The sort of work that I do has much more to do with people's attitudes and behaviors being basically a source of 2 main kinds of sociological things. One is the core of sociology, race, class, and gender, and that explains a lot, and it really does. That's like if you got those things, you can explain a lot about people's attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. But a lot of times these are capturing ongoing social influence processes that have been happening over the life course. And they get contained in these kinds of categories, and those categories can become reified. And we think that, well, men and women, they're different, right? But maybe that's because of their networks more than their biology, right? And so clearly the sociology and the biology supports that. So the point here is that interpersonal influences are ongoing processes. We can't, as long as we're social, we're kind of affecting each other and being affected by each other. And we consciously or unconsciously start to adopt the attitudes and behaviors of our peers in particular. Again, peers are particularly important for a lot of these things. Because, like my colleague here, Michael Tomasello, has shown, the thing that makes us different than other primates is that we form a we, like that, right? Right now, SNNH 24, well, like we've got an identity, we're a team, we got t-shirts, that's a thing. And we are able to do this, and we're able to generate with people who we share very little genetic material with. Right? It's like, we're not family, I mean, we are family, but it's like, we're not family. Something else I've studied communes and cults, and I've looked at the relationship, the interesting slippage between when people will start to call each other sister or brother who aren't actually biologically related. So obviously this is a health sort of seminar workshop. Peer influence is hugely important in terms of health behaviors, teeing up again for the ergum sturgum and particularly the Siena model tomorrow, that if you think about me, 16-year-old me, it's like how many cigarettes did I smoke before I met this person, and how many cigarettes did that person smoke before I met them, and then it's like, okay, now we have a tie, now we're friends, now we're peers. Now do I start smoking more, or do you start smoking less? Do we meet in the middle? Is there some kind of, so there's an underlying understanding of the process and what's spreading, and that shit's addictive. So, maybe it has a tendency to kind of ratchet itself up in terms of the person who's doing it spreads it to others more than the person who's doing it less. But also I think health beliefs and even worldviews are incredibly important for health. Trying to understand how people see the world, how they start to attach values and feelings and sort of how they see a behavior. I remember really thinking that it was cool to smoke, and I remember thinking and finding all kinds of reasons, like, well, it's part of, like, I'm a cutting edge, I don't care, so there's like ways of having a whole worldview. I'm an artist, we don't convention, life, it's the quality of your life, not the quantity. So all of these are kind of beliefs that can become attached and become a worldview. And that's something that spreads. That's something that you learn from others. Now, there are problems. There are always problems. But again, as I've said, the other spaghetti, most methods problems are theory problems in disguise. So these are problems, but you are not going to find a silver bullet to just take care of them. People who are like each other tend to form ties with each other. That's called homophily. And my colleague, Lynn Smith-Levin, wrote an excellent annual review piece on this. It's the most cited article in the annual review of Sociology and ever. Birds of a feather flock together. So people who are already similar are more likely to form ties. So if you don't take account of that, you might be confusing influence and selection, or homophily. There's reciprocity. People tend to form relationships and do things that they maybe exchange things. And if you aren't necessarily maybe seeing this, you might be seeing somebody giving something back to somebody. You might not, if you don't have the timing and when the relationship happened, you might be mistaking the directionality. Transitive closure, people tend to form ties with people who they're indirectly tied with. The friend of a friend is a friend. That can be conflated with some of these processes. People who are popular tend to get more popular, so maybe certain kinds of behaviors are indicative of being popular in certain contexts. So maybe the smokers in some high schools are the popular kids, and so people want to be like the popular kids, that they try to become friends with them. So maybe that's not a direct thing. Shared foci, like you might just be in a place where there's a similar kind of exposure to certain kinds of things. Like, so all of these are potentially, not necessarily for sure, could be conflated with interpersonal influences. So there are broadcast effects too. Like obviously, we're not just in a world where we only learn things and are influenced by our friends. We might see the same television show. We might go to the same concert. We may have other kinds of exposure to things outside. Like they may open up a Chick-fil-A next door, and then we're all there. It's like, oh yeah. So that might be conflated with thinking that I'm influencing you in terms of your eating behaviors. So, and economists, this is the realm of a lot of cranky economists, and like my friend's father, Ben Mansky's father at Northwestern, is like, talks about the reflection problem, like, is it, again, which is kind of like about reciprocity maybe, or things getting the timing order. There are some possible solutions to this stuff that aren't necessarily statistical. You may have a good idea for an experiment. You may be able to actually go in and do something like Hannah Shepard did a study where they went into high schools, or maybe middle schools too, I think, and they took the networks of the kids and friendship networks, and they were able to see the kids who were the more central nodes in the network, and then they were allowed to do an intervention where they tried to do an anti-bullying intervention. And so some of the popular kids volunteered to participate in the anti-bullying campaign, be in a student rally, wear these bracelets, have their faces on posters, trying to reduce bullying behavior. And then they had that matched with other schools where they did not have the more central students in the network. And they find some pretty interesting effects. That you can kind of change the culture maybe. You can maybe change the culture of a school. Now, with great power comes great responsibility. I don't know how I feel about all of that, but in this case, that's pretty brilliant. There are field experiments, so that's kind of more of a field experiment actually than a laboratory experiment. Laboratory experiments are you can bring people into the lab, you can manipulate the underlying structure of the network, or people like Damon Centola and others are doing this a lot now online with massive networks where they sort of vary the network topology. They'll say, okay, well, what happens if we make a small world where people can only communicate here, and then there are sort of like random weak ties, like quick interchanges? Do people change their behaviors? Like, we'll give everybody a Fitbit, and then we'll start to see who they communicate with, and does that lead to a global change? So there are ways of doing this with online experiments, perhaps, where you kind of as the researcher, you're manipulating the structure of the network, which is like a lot of researchers like, I get to play, network god. I will tell you, you're in a small world, and you're in an Erdős-Rényi network. Now let's see what you do. But obviously, the important part of these kinds of experiments is we can learn a lot about social exchange theory, and I'll talk about social influence network theory. There are some natural experiments, like one that was done, it's not really, so at Duke, like a lot of places, you used to be able to choose your freshman, your first year housemate, and so what happened? People went online, they went onto Facebook, they went and they selected people who were a lot like themselves, and from the same town, same race, same interests, same majors, things like that. And if part of the power of going to a university is that you get exposed to difference and that you start to maybe see the world in a different way because you become friends with people who are different than the friends that you had coming in, this selection process was working against that. And so just this year, our colleague Sarah Gaither, I think, the article should be out. I'm assuming it's going to make a big splash. But it was randomized. So people now, we have a totally different housing structure here. Quad X. It's everything X. It's so like Gen X. Quad X. It's like, it's not Twitter, it's X, Quad X is the model. They go into a dorm. They're randomized into a dorm, into housemates. And then they go, when they move from the East Campus to West Campus in the second year, they get funneled into dorms here with the same people. So, and so there are some very big effects in terms of who became, especially in terms of interracial friendships that came out of that randomization. So Jim talked a little bit about dyadic models. I'm a big fan of dyadic models, especially if you have a fairly large number of nodes in your network that are not necessarily as amenable to the kinds of Siena model and stuff that David Schaefer will talk about tomorrow. If you do happen to have networks that are, what would you say, Jim, 200, 300 nodes for Siena? Or it's like, Is David here? Hey, there you are. What's the, or now you're going to just say, oh, we can do it with 10,000 now, or?
I wouldn't do it. I mean, there's an assumption that everybody is aware of each other in the network. So you get out above 1,000, you start violating that assumption. But practice speaking, you can estimate, 2,000, 2,000,
Okay.
or multi-level with many networks.
Well, it's come a long way since I, waited maybe 3 or 4 weeks for and gave up on a network of maybe 300. So, but obviously the power of this approach is you can model the coevolution of behaviors and networks. As long as you have multiple time points, where you've observed it, you can actually capture, like, do people who smoke about the same tend to become friends with each other, right? That's homophily. We can take that out of the model, and then we can see whether or not they then stay friends or whether or not they start to smoke more. And I don't want to stay too much because that's what Dr. Schaefer will do. I'll talk a little bit more today about my own work in what's called social influence network theory. Just quickly, dyadic models, if the process is entirely dyadic, especially if you're looking at something like married couples and pairs, or I did an experimental study of dating, speed dating, like when people on speed dates click with each other when they don't, right? So it was like an experiment where they all sort of interacted, and they recorded it, and we basically tried to predict when do people click, right? That's an inherently dyadic process, and so it's kind of a core issue in terms of predicting the network, but not so much trying to predict the outcome of the network. So one of the more famous studies that was done was by Christakis and Fowler, 2007, and you're probably all familiar with this study, the Framingham Heart Study, which was data that wasn't collected for the purpose of doing a network analysis, but because they collected additional data on contacts, who would we contact, who are some of your friends, who's your spouse, other things. And because the town, Framingham, was small enough, they could link this up into a fairly connected structure, and then they could look over a 30-year period of time, and they could see changes in this network over time as the individuals generally got bigger, as people tend to as they age. But then, even though there's that general trend, like some were getting more big, right? So the idea was, have you seen the video of this? Have you showed this? Have you ever seen? You haven't seen it? Let's do it. I'm gonna drink some more coffee while we listen to this. Oh. Okay. Yeah, well, if the volume worked, we would be hearing, I think, what the colors are, but I don't. I apologize. I don't know. What's that? Oh, yeah. Okay, let's go back. Okay, I won't get near the speaker. I'll do my Jimi Hendrix kind of thing.
Is a dynamic graphic representation of a portion of the Framingham Heart Study social network. Each circle or node represents one person in the data set. Nodes with red borders are women, and nodes with blue borders are men. The size of each node is proportional to each person's body mass index, or BMI, which is the weight in kilograms divided by the square of the height in meters. A yellow node represents an obese person with a BMI greater than 30, and a green node represents a non-obese person. A line between two nodes represents a social connection between two people. Purple lines connecting nodes denote close genetic ties, for example, parents, children, and siblings. Gray lines denote non-genetic relations, such as friends and spouses. and dense as more ties appear. And the entire network gets heavier over time. Quantitative analyses demonstrate a tendency for obese people and non-obese people to form clusters within the network, so that by the end of the study, this clustering can be discerned as in the densely interconnected clusters of obese persons here, and the non-obese persons here. The prevalence of obesity appears lower at the periphery of the network as compared with the center.
Yeah, so again, the study, it made a huge impact, and immediately the economists got very, very cranky, and that's their job. It's all right, But, the identification strategy, what are all the conflating factors? And so, we have a lot to learn there about, instrumental variables and all the other approaches that you might use, but then it opens up a whole other cans of worms. So a lot of this stuff is about disciplinary, standards, right? In sociology, we definitely don't obsess as much about really capturing the exact coefficient, but as long as we've done a due diligence to say, well, the effect is clearly there, and it's kind of in this range. So again, most methods problems are really theory problems in disguise. And Christakis and Fowler did a lot of due diligence that I think was kind of overlooked in the hoopla. A lot of people just, pimples seem to spread as well. We went and reanalyzed it, and acne seems to spread through these networks, and it's outrageous. That couldn't possibly be the case. And you kind of go could, actually, or maybe there's, but then. So anyway, I think it's more about trying to do your due diligence. Again, no one study is going to do it. No one analysis is going to do it. They compared the social distance between ego and alter and the geographic distance between ego and alter. For one, in terms of the relative increase in the probability of obesity in an ego if alter becomes obese. And they had 7 different examinations of this, and they find, as you can see across these, that the social distance is way more important than the physical distance. So what explanation? That definitely helps to discount the idea that it's just that delicious Chick-fil-A opened up next door, right? And that it's instead something about people's social comparisons with people. That might be the mechanism. Is your hand up? Yeah.
I don't understand why it discounts that, because we know that people's access to nutrition is guided by more than geography. The same type of people across the whole nation have the same type of access to grocery stores, healthy foods. So I don't really understand why we could say this has anything to do with peer influence. Specifically,
This is more of a sensitivity analysis, I think, which is you would expect. In other words, you would expect if this finding was really driven by geography and by a broadcast effect of just being in the same neighborhood, having the same socioeconomic status that might be tied to geography, or being located in a certain space in which you maybe have better access to fresh, you're not in a food desert, or you are in a food desert, and so you're basically looking at the physical distance between people, and you're comparing that to the social distance. And in this case, the physical distance doesn't really seem to matter all that much. But the social distance, that is, whether or not we're directly tied or indirectly tied through our peer or kinship networks, is the thing that seems to matter the most. Now, I'm not saying that boom, drop the mic, we did it, I'm out, right? But this is a sensitivity analysis, right?
Yeah, maybe I'm getting too much into the nitty-gritty of this specifically.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, do the methods of peer influence, rather than looking at geography, look at how these social distance might have, be closely correlated with context? Not just because we're farther apart, we know that the new Chick-fil-A opening up means that this is why people are getting obese or not. Like, the people who are socially close are also more likely to exist.
Well, but this is a small town. Yeah. Yeah, it's a geographically constrained area, so yeah. I mean, I'm not saying, again, it's like, have we completely taken care of the error term here? I don't think that's the point. Jim, do you have something to add as well? Yeah. Yeah, so you can sweep that, you can kind of sweep that effect away and see what's left. And yeah. Please. Well, that's a great question too. So I'll get to that in a second. Yeah. The point is that these are the kinds of questions that we should all be asking. This is the mind of like a scientist, which is, what if I'm wrong, right? Like, I want to really prove myself wrong. And if I can't, then I'm going to just provisionally accept that I'm probably right, okay? And I think that that's the process here. So the other way they tried to do this is they looked at the different types of ties. So maybe this will also help explain a little bit of what you're getting at, which is it seems that if ego perceives Alter as a friend, that matters. And it matters even more if it's reciprocated. If I say you're my friend and you say I'm your friend, then that has the largest effect. But interestingly, if you think I'm your friend, but I don't think you're my friend, that doesn't seem to matter. So that directionality check really points to a mechanism that's more about social comparison. Like, you're in my world. My pipe of influence is open to you, right? Because I perceive you as my friend. Now, you perceive me as your friend, and I don't perceive you as no pipe. Okay? So, again, it's you can look at this effect, in terms of its comparison with siblings, which, spouse, it's even stronger than your spouse. So it points to a mechanism that suggests a connection between attitudes and behaviors, a connection between a certain norm and what one thinks of as terms of maybe how much one consumes or what a body should look like. And as sociologists, obviously, there's no judgment call here. I believe people can be healthy at every size, and maybe that's a controversial thing or not among health scholars. But I do think that I do want to just put a note there that there's another level at which, like, there's a lot of other things going on here that we should think of in terms of social construction. Yes?
How is the causality established? How do we know it's not a case that people simply prefer to establish and maintain relationships with people with similar body sizes?
Yeah. So how do we get the homophily effect? And that's connected with your question. I will get to that in a second. Yeah. And I'm not going to say that it's not like they just hit this out of the ballpark, or else they wouldn't have gotten beat up by every economist. I do want to say that there are other sort of dyadic approaches that I've done in the study of the Stanford faculty and their collaboration networks over time. This gets at a certain kind of robustness check in some ways that I think also gets a little bit at your concern, which is, hey, if I collaborate with you, then, and we do well and we publish, then maybe we're just going to keep on collaborating together more, and that this is a kind of like, or if the sort of equivalent might be, if we go out to eat together and that's a thing that we do, then it's a kind of synergistic effect, that it's a kind of part, it's not exogenous to the network. It's like, well, what do you do together? Well, we're central people in the network, right? You notice that they tend to be the ones who got bigger. There may be people who have more friends, and having more friends means that you go out with people and you do things. And so maybe that's part of being a friend in Framingham. I don't know. Maybe part of being a productive scholar at Stanford is we just get together and we talk and we write lots of grants and we just, that's the network. But if we're really thinking about influence, you would think that the influence would have a spillover effect. That if we were able to see somebody's behaviors or attitudes, in this case behaviors really, apart from the social tie, that it would change their behavior. In other words, I'm going to be smoking more by myself, after I am influenced to smoke more. And it's not just I smoke with my friend. We're just all smoking more together. That's what it means to be a friend here in Eugene, Oregon in 1989. This is we smoke. That was part of it. But by myself, contemplating the stars, I'm smoking more. With my brother, who's my, kind of my friend, I'm smoking more, right? So there's some way that outside of that, there's a spillover effect. So there may be ways to kind of parse out that over time. And that's what we were able to do a little bit in the Stanford study by looking at, do people write more grants? If I write a grant with Jim, who's a master grant writer, I'm going to learn some stuff, right? And am I going to take what I learned and am I going to bring it over into writing grants with other people? And am I going to be better at it? And I would say I probably am. And based on the model, we looked at the number of the total spillover effect in writing grants and through different kinds of network ties, whether or not we collaborate on a grant together or we're on a dissertation committee together or we're just in the same center together. So different kinds of ties might be more conducive for certain kinds of behaviors. They might have a kind of elective affinity for us learning certain kinds of things. So we found that in this case, obviously there was a kind of a direct effect of writing grants on me being better at writing grants. So if I sit on a dissertation committee with Jim, I might learn a little bit of the mojo. I might get a little better at writing a grant, but I'm not going to get that much better at writing a grant. Question?
Yeah, I'm still not understanding how we connect it to peer influence. If you maybe Jim just writes grants with people who also have excellent early childhood education, just because they speak the same language, they get along really well, and it's not actually peer influence.
It's a selection. Yeah. Well, I think that I think that you can handle that in a lot of different ways, right? You can include all kinds of controls, and then you could get cranky and be like omitted variable bias, right? There's none of that. You could also compare against different similar others in the network. So there are ways of handling those issues, right? They're not fatal flaws to the model. I will get more into modeling around some of this in a minute. But the general idea is that you can include a lot of different fixed effects. So maybe we just say, look, we've got this over and we did this. We've got 15 years of data. We got 15 Jims. We've got 15 Craigs. Nothing different. We'll just stick in a fixed effect for each of us, right? And so then do we see changes? So you can sweep away all of that stable stuff. It's like I had excellent handwriting when I was 4. Gone, right? That's not in the model. So again, these are nitty-gritty things. I'm happy to hang out. We're having a pig poll. We can talk more about this stuff, right? What I want you to get is I want you to just have the drive to know this stuff, right? So I like that you want to know it. And I just want to assure you that there are tools for getting us really closer to it. Jim, do you have anything else to add to it?
It depends on how deeply you're going to go to the modeling stuff next, but I think the main question is there's always this discussion between what's observable and what's unobservable. And what's unobservable and controllable, and what's unobservable and uncontrollable. So anything that's fixed, so that the unobservable and controllable is like the fixed effects that we see here. The unobservable and uncontrollable are some time-varying, unobserved measure that you think is affecting, that is confounding your peer influence with whatever the thing might be out there. And I think what the beauty that the critics of these models have taken for these kinds of approaches is that things you don't know are frightening. But if you think about it for a minute, how big can the monster be under your bed? It's only 3 inches tall under there, right? There's not a lot of room left for a big monster under the bed. Once you control for the observable, control for the fixed unobservable, the unobservable confounders that could actually change the result are really hard to think about. Like, what are those things? So is it mathematically possible? Actually, probably not. And that's what Ken Frank's entire systematic sort of work on sensitivity analysis is about, is that you can actually estimate the size of how big an unobserved variable would have to correlate with the observed variable in your model to discount the sec, or to turn it around an experimental framework, and you can understand how many of your cases would have to be experimentally removed from a treatment effect to a control effect in order to invalidate your response. You can actually put a number on that from how big it would be. And it turns out that the vast majority of times, there's nothing left out there that could be that big. And so I think that we're afraid of things that we're afraid of the monster under the bed because we can't look under the bed, but we can't estimate how big the space under the bed is for the monster to hide. And most of the time, it's not nearly as big as we might think it is.
All right, I do want to, okay, I'm just going to skip over all the stochastic actor-oriented stuff, because come back tomorrow morning and you'll learn all about this. I've used it, I've done it, it's cool. You should learn how to do it, and you'll find lots of cool things that way if you persist. Now, I was trained in this area, social influence network theory, that I'll touch upon briefly. I don't want to take up too much of Jim's time, and but I do want to just put down a big flag here for this type of model, which is was really developed by one of my dissertation advisors, Noah Friedkin, and really captures the two aspects that of these processes. I think the sort of initial socialization model, race, class, gender, whatever, gets you to time one in your thinking about the world or your behavior. Generally, this is done a lot on opinions or beliefs or attitudes. So, do you believe, and a lot of this has also been done a lot in political polarization research, so trying to think about whether or not people are for or against certain kinds of issues. And that's some kind of linear combination of things in your life and some coefficient attached to that linear combination of things. Controlling for, putting that aside, there is this other process going on, which could be more or less pronounced, which is a social influence process, which is, again, let's not belabor the math, but it is cool. It is cool. If you're the sort of person, or you live in the sort of world, let's say, where everybody basically thinks that they're right 100% of the time, then there is no social influence. That means you've attributed absolutely nothing to others. And that's what this alpha is. So 1 minus 0 is 1, and this becomes your time 1 belief. This is wiped out. There's no social influence process at all. But most people in most worlds, most things, there's some kind of balance. People attribute some influence to others. And they may not attribute equal influence to everybody in their group. When Jim says something, I attribute more influence, especially around certain kinds of salient topics. I'm like, yes, I put that on him. And so that's what this W matrix is. The W matrix is the attribution of influence to others in the group that can vary from 0 to 1. If we belong to a cult, if we're all in a cult of Jim, we're all Jimlets, then we all attribute 100% of our influence to him. We attribute 0 to everybody in here. We're like, what are we doing? All right? And then we do it. All right? That's a W matrix that has an entry where all of us, it's completely, this is why it's called a social influence network. The network itself is the attributions of a kind of weight to others. The weight can only sum to one. There's only so much of me to be open to others. And so if I attribute some to myself, then that ipso facto makes it so that I can't attribute it to others. So if it's 100% me, I'm just like, I'm perfect. It was absolutely perfect. There's nothing, for me to be influenced by because I'm perfect, right? Now, if I'm a person who's completely, insecure and I have no idea what I think and I just give it all to everybody else, right? Then I'm going to shift a lot. This model has been estimated in a lot of experimental conditions, bringing people into the lab, having them kind of like a mock jury situation, Is he guilty? Okay, well, how much money should be given in this case? We have to we're going to try to come to consensus on this. We may not come to consensus on it. So it's an iterative process so that at time t, my opinion is some combination of how much influence I accord to others and their previous beliefs at the previous iteration, plus whatever I weight my own opinion at the initial time of our encounter. So generally, this model has been elaborated in lots of different ways. So I basically explained all of this. The weights are constrained to be between 0 and 1. The sum of them is 1. You can look at this in terms of a network effect, that you have a network of people, but how much influence do you attribute? Maybe you attribute even influence through your ties, like everybody in this case, gets an equal weight of that and their own opinions. These people aren't tied, so 1 and 4. 1 accords no influence to 4 because they're not tied to 4. You could think about it in terms of like maybe I weight everybody twice myself, or maybe it's a entirely network structure. Like the more central you are to the network, the more people accord influence to you. So there's generally a way that people gain prestige and status in a network, and those people have more influence. And that's partly why they're in the center of the network. So you can then look at this as an iterative process of interpersonal influences as they unfold over time. And if you put it on a kind of network scheme, a kind of underlying topology, where maybe there are 3 different groups, and initially people just have random opinions in this world. Maybe they have 2 random opinions. They like Beyonce, or they like Taylor Swift, and some people like both, some people like neither. As a lot of people kind of more in the middle. It's just a random tastes or not for 2 different artists. And then if you unfold over 7 iterations and you accord some influence to others in the network over time will start to converge onto something like a consensus, but in this case, because of the network structure, it never fully becomes realized as a complete consensus. The other part of the model that's interesting is that people may have heterogeneity in how much they attribute influence to others, and so maybe there are, again, some opinion leaders in the group. So if we put in to the group, in this case, the alpha varies across people. So some people are just inherently more open to influence. They live in the same world. Some people are really closed off to influence. Whatever is there is distributed among a weighted matrix of alters. So this allows for certain kinds of people to be opinion leaders in the group that have more pull, maybe for some people. It also allows maybe for some people to hold consensus in hostage, that they don't listen to anybody but themselves, and so they will not converge. So they're either going to be an outlier, or people are going to, if anybody attributes any influence to that person, then that person can make the group eventually. Maybe after 10 years, we converge on that person's belief because they just are stubbornly it's what was it, the 12 Angry Men sort of model of this. So if you have a group leader here, and you have a group leader down here, and you iterate this opinions of artists over time, you'll start to see through the network, it starts to actually be, arrayed in a kind of a different sort of structure of disagreement, and perhaps a kind of polarized world in which people are kind of converging on two different opinion leaders. Okay. Over time, I don't have time to share all of the cool stuff. I've studied book groups and how they converge on opinions around a novel. I've been studying Duke Divinity students and their social networks and how they converge or not on attitudes and beliefs around sexuality in the Bible. I've incorporated a lot of different things into this. What if beliefs are interconnected with each other? If I stop believing in Adam and Eve, then maybe is that connected with a belief in sexuality or not? And people are telling me it is, so what happens? If I change this, do I change that? So what happens when you start to think about whole worldviews and how worldviews may be more or less constrained in this process? I lied and I didn't get to the statistical model of Christakis and Fowler, but the answer to some of it is that they include a lot of lagged effects, right? So they're like, well, let's just control for your belief or your size at time one, or let's just put in other kinds of controls for it. So that again, these are nitty-gritty modeling questions. They will never solve all your problems. So in the end, the sort of takeaway is, boy, I had a lot more slides to show. The takeaway is there's no perfect solution. Science is a team sport, and we're on the same team. Okay, thank you.